All right, good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock on Wednesday, which means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and really fortunate, excited to host this webinar. We have Dr. Wesley Everman, that's an extension weed specialist and assistant professor here at Iowa State University. And it's going to talk on a really important topic of challenges in our weed management decisions, certainly something so many farmers are faced with and good to think about as we start our planting season here and thinking about weed, maybe still opportunities to adjust our weed management. So as always, if you have questions or comments for Dr. Everman, please type those in the chat box and I'll get those to him at the end of his talk. With that, Wesley, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right. Do we need to do anything with this first
Not,
slide or
not yet. Nope, we'll do that at the end.
this one? All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, good to be here today, and thank you for having me. I'm gonna try to do a higher level view of some of the challenges we're facing here in Iowa, and really it's the same challenges around the country. But when we look at things, we've got increased resistance in our key weed species, an increased reliance on fewer and fewer herbicide groups, right? So as we get more resistance, we have fewer herbicides to use. A lot of this comes down to a lack of diversity in our management on the landscape level, and that's for a number of reasons, right? Like, if I can ad lib for a minute here, a lot of it comes down to how our farms are often run nowadays, right? It comes down to the dollars and cents, paying back a loan at the end of the year, or really tight margins. And we have to go with what's the simplest and most cost effective in our management system. And oftentimes that drives us towards using a single management style, a single set of herbicides across a lot of acres. And that's just a recipe for having some issues. So I want to talk about some of this, and then we also do have weed species that kind of show up on the landscape and can cause some, really fast response or maybe major shifts in our production, right? So these are kind of our big challenges. And tackling this, it's great to sit on campus and say, oh, I can tell you the things to do. In practice, we have to look at it more as what are we going to change in little bites that make it doable? And how do we tackle this in a way that keeps us sustainable, keeps people on the farm? So I'll lay out a few of the things that we're facing, some of the things that are on the horizon, and then really how we'll try to tie this together going forward. So when we look at things, first thing we got to do is look at what are our key species, what are our top priorities for management. This one is one a lot of folks were very familiar with probably 20 or 30 years ago. From what I understand, it's not nearly the challenge it used to be. This is horseweed or mare's tail, as it's often known throughout the state. It starts out typically as a winter annual. It'll be that little rosette and then bolt up. And about this time of year, usually the one on the left is what we are seeing in our burn down situations. It's mostly a weed of no-till fields or minimum till, but we can also get quite large plants that can be very damaging to our crops. It can have a lot of competition. There is resistance to glyphosate in this species, and that's where it was really a big challenge. Glyphosate was a key burn down product, but still is on many acres, developed resistance and exploded. It's a wind-blown seed, so it moved across the landscape quite quickly. Another one that also is a challenge in a lot of areas, and we're starting to see this time of year, they're starting to pop up. Last week, I got the first reports that they were germinating. This one's common ragweed. Again, there's resistance in this species to different herbicides. most notably glyphosate, but there's also ALS and PPO resistance in certain parts of the country. This is one for us is typically early germinating and not a terrible problem later in the season, but an early season weed, as is giant ragweed. This one historically was more of a ditch or wasteland weed, not a big challenge for a lot of our production fields, but it's been creeping in off of the edges. We're also seeing resistance in giant ragweed to glyphosate, some ALS inhibitors. So this is one we're keeping an eye on. It's not been a huge issue, but again, as we use one set of herbicides over and over, we select for resistance in certain species. These first three that I discussed are issues in different states, and definitely we have resistance here in Iowa. The next one is very common across the state. However, we don't have documented resistance at all, but it can be challenging. This is common lamb's quarters. We see this in a lot of fields. Historically, it was one very common when it was pure glyphosate as our herbicide. Now, with the introduction of other herbicides in the mixes and trying to control the water hemp, they've been much more effective on the lamb's quarters, and we don't see it as a major weed, but it's still a common one. Probably the most common around the state would be giant foxtail. We do have resistance to a couple herbicide groups in giant foxtail. However, again, it's not one that is resistant to glyphosate. It's not one that's a major resistance issue right now, but across the country, we're starting to see more glyphosate resistance show up in grass species. Before I came here, I was at North Carolina State University. We found two different grass species that were glyphosate resistant, and unfortunately, they were also ACCase resistant, which meant in a broadleaf crop like soybeans, we could not control it once it came up. So it's something we need to keep in mind. It's not right in our face, but as we're seeing this start to happen in other areas, we need to take note and be aware of what could be on the horizon. Most notably, right in our face, of course, is water hemp. This is one we've been fighting for years. ALS resistance, PPO resistance, glyphosate resistance, triazines, HPPDs. We have a number of different resistant biotypes in the state of Iowa. In fact, we even have populations that are resistant to dicamba as well as 2,4-D, and we're in the process of investigating one we believe is resistant to the group 15s, which would be metolachlor like dual. So this is our biggest challenge. This is our biggest problem weed, and a lot of our decisions are made around this one weed. One thing that does, often we focus on controlling this weed and we get very specific on what works. And it opens doors and opportunities for other weeds to come in and become a challenge if we get this one under control. I mentioned the new species showing up. This is a cousin to the water hemp, and this is Palmer amaranth. None of you will be happy that it's here, but I'll admit I was happy it was here before I got here. I did not want to be accused of being the guy that brought it from the south. This does present unique challenges. We're going to be doing a little bit of work on how to manage this in Iowa so that we can be prepared and have solutions if it does get established and start to spread in the state. Hopefully, we can identify some key management practices and we can do some things to keep it from spreading and becoming an issue here in Iowa. Now, there has been some studies and surveys around the state looking at the prevalence of water hemp and what herbicides it's resistant to. There were two different surveys done, one in 2013, one in 2019. I plan to continue this and do a third in 2025. Just so happens they're spaced 6 years apart. In that first survey, 2013, the populations were 90% resistant to pursue the ALS inhibitor family, and then 75 to 80% resistant to atrazine and glyphosate. There was no resistance observed to the PPO inhibitors. That's the group 14. Cobra is the example in this slide. And then there's just a handful resistant to the group 27 HPPD inhibitors, which is represented by Callisto. 6 years later, they went back to the same locations, tested similar populations, and they found that resistance to the ALS inhibitors and glyphosate is near 100%. Atrazine increased slightly. So three of these herbicides, don't really control water hemp post-emergence in most of the state. Cobra, the PPO inhibitors, we saw about 15% were resistant there and about the same for the HPPDs. Once we do this survey, we'll know where we're at, but a lot of folks have been telling me those PPO inhibitors and HPPD inhibitors aren't working as well as they have in the past. So as we look at these two numbers, 6 years ago, I don't know where we'll land. I expect them to increase. I hope we keep it below 50%. If we keep that, well, we won't be keeping it, but if we find that that number is below 50%, that means we can still utilize these on half of the fields. But time will tell what the survey shows. I think it'll be important to help us make decisions and plan going forward. Now, what this does, we start losing options, right? We see over time, we have the resistance to the ALS, the trizines, then glyphosate, then HPPD, then PPO. And I try to show this to growers so that, they can think about their options and what's happening. So I put these next few slides together to show what happens. And this is our soybean herbicide efficacy table post-emergence right out of the weed control guide. I have water hemp highlighted there. And so the first two lines, that's our grass herbicides and Basagran. They don't control water hemp at all. So we'll black them out. And then we got our glyphosate resistance, black it out. And then PPOs, ALS, herbicides. And then most recently, there's been the dicamba resistance found, and it's not an option in soybeans anymore anyway, or right now, and 2,4-D resistance. So I'll up and say, okay, everybody's going to spray Liberty, right? But how long will that last? We put a lot of pressure on one or two herbicides. They aren't going to last a long time. Now, the sky's not falling. The dicamba 2,4-D resistance is very isolated. These are still options, but this is the path we're heading down. These are the trends we have to be aware of, and we have to take them seriously. And it's not just in Iowa. This is looking at stacked resistance, multiple resistance. This is from the website weedscience.org. This Ian Heap, he compiles cases of resistance around the world. This figure shows cases of multiple resistance. Now, this dark red, kind of maroon color with the circles is cumulative cases of multiple resistance around the world. The red squares is two-way resistance. And then we see all of these increase over time, right? What we're doing is incremental selection of the next herbicide, the next herbicide. So we have three-way, four-way, 5, 6, and most recently, a species that is 7-way resistant. So this doesn't mean annual bluegrass around the world has resistance to 7 different herbicides. This means there's a biotype out there that 7 different herbicides do not work. And if you look here, we have biotypes of water hemp that are resistant to 5 different mechanisms, Palmer amaranth resistant to 6 different mechanisms. This tells us a really great story. This is the path we're on. We need to be paying attention. We need to be trying to get ahead of these things. Okay. And we have 4 and 5-way resistant water hemp in Iowa already. We just need to keep it at bay and try not to get more resistance added to it. So at this point, everybody feels good, right? We're all doomed. What? We're doomed. These weeds are going to win. And there's a little truth. The weeds are programmed to win, right? They're successionally first or early successional plants. They are inherently created to fill voids, to be the first ones to populate waste space. So a lot of their genetics allows them to adapt to different conditions. So especially water hemp, right? It's dioecious, male and female plants. Every single offspring, every single plant is a hybrid. So that hybrid nature means there's all kinds of genes out there in that water hemp complex that allow them to adapt to different conditions, different stresses. And that might be moisture stress, heat stress, cold stress, might be pathogens. It might be low pH, high pH. Herbicides are just a really strong selector on those stresses. And that's why we see this show up so easily. Now, we do have new things on the horizon to help us out. This is an example of technology where we use machine vision to identify and target a spray on weeds. This is John Deere's example of the See and Spray. There's Bosch's Green Eye has a similar setup. I mean, they're different. They're developed differently, but they both target weeds. And also one more recently called Eco Robotics. They're coming out with a shielded sprayer where they're targeting weeds with machine vision as well. So there's a number of different companies coming into this space, bringing a solution. We also have drones, right? We got aerial application. We're seeing more folks utilizing these on small acres, individual spot cleanup. How long before we see swarms? How long before we see folks having different fleets of drone sprayer application? It's a good question. I'm not sure, but it's a technology people see value in and are utilizing more and more. This one's rather interesting. I date myself with my jokes sometimes, but the only thing we need here is a shark because this is a laser, right? We got freaking lasers killing these weeds, man. So that's Austin Powers for anybody that's young enough to not know. But laser weeders, again, they're targeting weeds. They use machine vision to identify the weed and zap them. You can kind of see here in that second one, that light, that's actually the laser going down and zapping those weeds. I've seen these, in use. I'll be honest, a challenge for us in corn and bean country would be the speed. They go rather slow, like 3 mile an hour through a field. Be hard to cover a lot of acres, but it's another option, right? Another option too that's gaining popularity, especially in the western part of the country, harvest weed seed control. This is an example of an impact mill. There's Redicop, there's Harrington, there's several others out there, the Seed Terminator. They all work on the premise of separating the seed from the straw. You use that chaff. You run that chaff fraction through that impact mill and it damages the seed coat. These have varying degrees of success. We probably need a little engineering help to make them viable in our high biomass systems, but they do work at impacting the viability of seed going back to that seed bank. Be some work being done to map weeds a little bit more effectively. This is some work I did in Palmer Amaranth in North Carolina. I'm doing the same with water hemp this coming year, but we were able to identify Palmer Amaranth patches at different densities in soybean and separate them with pretty high accuracy. Also, we can do more research with these see and spray type technologies, the green eyes, the eco robotics, the drones. The challenge is all of these still rely on herbicides. There are some novel application platforms using the lasers and also even liquid nitrogen to freeze out the growing point. We might have to go these other routes because as we lose our herbicides, the platforms that rely on them aren't going to be as successful either. The thing is, everybody's waiting for and looking for the next silver bullet, right? There's a lot of techno optimism in grower groups and with farmers that there's going to be the next Roundup that shows up. And that's going to be very difficult to find. So, in the meantime, what we have to focus on is more basic things we can do. Minimizing the seed bank is huge. That's our number one way we can work on managing resistance. If we reduce the number of seeds going to the seed bank, we have fewer weeds emerging each year. We have less selection pressure on all of our management options. If we control our escapes at the end of the year, we see these big weeds. Preventing them from setting seed and sending it back to the seed bank is the only way to keep resistant traits from spreading. And I like to say here, there's one way that's really effective on annual weeds. I don't know if you guys have heard about wraparound, but if you see my camera, what you do is you take your hand, you wrap it around that plant and you pull it, and it's really effective. All right. The other keys, I mean, they're pretty straightforward. We've been doing these for years. We don't want to depend on a single herbicide site of action. We want to use full rates, and that includes our sequentials and tank mixes. We don't want to cut rates if we're mixing things. We want to be timely with our post sprays. We want to start clean when we plant our crop and then take advantage of our non-chemical cultural practices. More and more, this is the direction we're going to have to go. What was old is now going to be new again, right? We're going to want to use these practices to get ahead of the game and integrate our weed management using cover crops, row spacing. There's been some success varying populations based on weed maps, even planting dates. Research at Iowa State showed success with cereal rye cover crop. If we can get 4,000 to 5,000 pounds per acre, we can be successful in suppressing water hemp. And if we add a herbicide to the mix, here, for example, we had the cover crop with two different post herbicides and residual herbicides combined, gave some of the greatest control. So we can put these things together and often tell growers we don't have to do cover crops on every acre. We don't have to do some of these integrated practices on every acre, but try them out and see where they fit. We can play around with more herbicide mixtures, and overlapping residuals is something that worked for us in the Southeast, especially when we were losing our post herbicide options. And this is really, we lay out a pre-herbicide at planting. And before this runs out, before we lose control with it, we put down a post-applied residual product. So we overlap the residual control and we widen that window that we don't really need post-herbicides. Takes a lot of pressure off of the post-herbicide in the system and gives a little bit cleaner fields for a little longer. Now, this works because water hemp has a long window of emergence, right? It doesn't just emerge early and then, it's done like the ragweed, right? That ragweed emerges early in the season and it tops out. Water hemp emerges throughout our season. So if we get extended control from our residual herbicides, from a cover crop plus post with residual, right? These things, we use the biology or understanding of the biology to develop better management systems. So that's how we need to go going forward, right? That's pretty much the nutshell. I think I got my slides out of order. We got to get back to basics, right? Use these different management practices in an integrated form, but we got to do it smart because at the end of the day, the dollars and cents are the key. I will put this up real quick. If you have questions or need to get in touch with me, here's my email, my cell phone number. Um, Happy to help out anytime I can. And with that,
All
that
right.
that's that.
Okay. Thank you, Wes. That was great. Important. Okay. Logistical items. If you watch this webinar live, oh, okay. First off, I'm going to get back to, okay, somebody wanted you to go back to the contact information slide. So you can
Okay.
go there while I do the one about the CCA. So if you are on this and want to earn a CCA credit, uh, please email Elena Whitaker, and her email is alenaw at iastate.edu. Again, alenaw at iastate.edu. Email her by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw at iastate.edu. Folks can get their questions in as well as I go through a couple more slides. So now if we can go to the next one. Um, Next one would be on the voluntary demographic survey. Oop, back
Oop.
one. There we go. Okay. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, that we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. If you filled one out for a 2025 webinar, thank you so very much. If not, and you're willing to do so, we'd greatly appreciate it. We'll go to the next slide and plug the webinar for next week. What's under the drain? Understanding farmer perspectives on tile drainage investments. Wow, this is now getting to my wheelhouse or interest area. So Dr. Hung Li Feng, who's assistant professor in the Department of Economics and the Center for Agricultural and Rural Development, will be talking about that. So tune in next week at noon for that. Then I think there might be one more slide. Um, uh, if you uh, if you watch this webinar live and are interested in going and watching the previous webinar, or you wonder if this will be archived to share with somebody else, it will be either on the iowalearningfarms.org slash webinars site, or we have an Iowa Learning Farms webinars YouTube page. So you can go and watch it there. Okay, so let's go. There was maybe a first question here, Wes. Can you go back to the cultural practices slide and give us your opinion as to the most effective ones?
Yeah, so I think this probably summarizes
Okay.
most of them. You know, I'll be honest, a lot depends on individual systems and situations, right? Different weed species respond differently to these different practices. Row spacing, if you have the capability in your equipment and don't have to buy a whole new planter, is one that can be very effective. Cover crops, if we get to that higher biomass, gives good weed suppression. But in a winter like this year, biomass was hard to produce. And so it's not going to give as much value there. Um, Personally, I think both of those work really well. The crop population stuff is, I think it's emerging. We still need to do a little bit more research on it, but the research has shown success that we can lower the population in low weed density areas of the field and then raise the crop population in high weed density areas. And that way you don't increase your seed costs, you just shift where you're putting it. So those are ones I think are effective on the cultural side. Yeah.
Somebody asked if you had a link to the weed photos along with the weed name, and maybe that's if there's a location for a weed ID guide, maybe.
Yeah, we're working on a weed ID
Okay,
guide.
cool.
So
Okay,
stay tuned later this
okay,
year or early next. But yeah, I'll plug a couple of sites that are pretty good. Missouri has a pretty good online weed ID site, and so does Virginia Tech. So those are a
okay,
couple places that'd be good to look.
okay. Yeah, and we'll probably, hopefully, once the weed ID guide is out, we can kind of plug that with our Learning Farms blog so people can get that information. Um, okay, there's one here, whether they wondered if you had tried controlling weeds by spring seeding Balanza clover and planting corn into that clover.
So I haven't tried that specifically, but again, a lot of the success from the cover crops is in the biomass produced to give that mulch layer to really suppress germination of the weeds. So if you're spring seeding, you'd probably want to, I would assume, terminate late, like plant and then terminate. I'm not certain, but there's been some success with that. Often with a cereal rye cover, people don't want to have two grasses
Yeah,
growing at once because you get that green bridge for disease and insects. But maybe with the clover, that would be a little more acceptable.
yeah,
So I could see where that could be valuable. There's been a little bit more work even looking at intercropping and kind of keeping that there. We were playing around a little bit with strip tilling into stuff like clover and others, planting our crop
yeah,
and keeping that cover crop there a little bit longer. And it looks good. The big question is in a dry spring where moisture is limiting, how much does it rob from the crop? How much does it impact that early growth? That's
yeah.
really the big question.
Okay. Yeah, interesting question there. And that makes me think back. We did Cura clover. We had that in for 5 to 8 years at a site. And now I wish we would have done a little work to look at the weeds in that. I guess I wasn't a close a friend with Bob Hartzler at that time to look at the weeds because we didn't do a very good job growing corn, uh, but we weren't strip tilling and maybe our weed suppression was pretty good, but uh,
Yeah.
um, there was a question here. Um, I guess somebody was asking if you're going to talk on the point system for the Endangered Species Program at all. They enjoyed, there was a roundtable in Adel a couple weeks ago related to this.
Yeah.
Maybe any information on that?
So I'm working on some. I'll probably post to YouTube. I gotta figure out where to post them yet, but I'm working on several what I'm calling bite-size videos on. I'm shooting for about 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes tops, on how to calculate your points for, um, definitely for different counties, but also different tillage systems, trying to help get through the best way to get your points. I
Okay.
didn't want to include it here just for the sake of the overview, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely something. Hopefully, um, at least by May, in May
Okay.
sometime, I hope to have those posted.
Okay. Yeah, and that'd be another one. If when you get those posted, if you can just forward them to us, then we'll make sure they get on the ILF blog. So then, anybody that's seen this, the more ways we can hopefully get that information out, the better. So,
Yeah,
um,
because that's definitely a important topic that
okay,
we do need to have a better understanding of.
okay. I think that really answers our questions in there. If anybody has one burning, please type in quick. But I'll do a wrap up here. And again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number, and get that to her by 5 o'clock today. Please tune in if you're interested in drainage. Tune in next week for Dr. Hong Li Feng. And as always, as always, uh, the webinar will be archived. Somebody asked in here, last one, how long were those tail feathers?
They were probably average, but it was they were long enough to make that smile pretty big.
Pretty big. All right. All right. Wes, thank you so much for participating with Iowa Learning Farms webinar. Hopefully we can get you back as you get more ingrained at Iowa State and some of the research you'll be working on. So really greatly appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.